Hey there, I'm Keenan Fry and you're watching the Acid Drip. So we got a cool video today. I had a pretty cool request from this guy. I'm going to bring him over here. My new friend, Rahul Kumar. I had a cool conversation with him about Dan Seagrave. He looked at my video, Transcend the Rubicon, Benediction. It's a record by Benediction. And the artwork is by Seagrave, of course. And this guy's like, hey, I like Seagrave, and I saw your Benediction album cover thing, your art analysis thing. And this guy said, Goreguts. One of my all-time favorite is Goreguts Considered Dead, the album cover. So I have an art analysis for you, Rahul Kumar. Thank you for being a fan and checking out my stuff. Thank you for being a cool dude. You're a cool motherfucker. All right, so we're going to talk about the perspective that's going into this, and we're going to talk about why it works the way it does, and we're going to talk about shooting from the hip, which is a term that I've become more and more appreciative of in these last years. For starters, we got a couple of things going on with this. I'm going to actually turn off this top layer real quick. I'm going to just turn everything off and let's try to identify some focal point elements. We got some compositional elements arranged roughly into three areas, and then we have a compositional frame. We have what I would call a 3/4 compositional frame, and then we have three kind of compositional elements, and then we have this binary element as well. So the binary element is the Goreguts title and the Considered Dead, which was obviously done after the painting. All right, so the guy does the painting and that's put on top. So that binary thing right there, we're not going to consider it as part of the painting. We'll consider it part of the graphic, and the graphic is different than a painting. It's the final design that's going to be put on the product, right? So like a graphic is like a soup can wrap or like a soda label. It's all that. It's the thing that actually goes on the product. And so like when you have the title on here, you have the completed graphic. It's now the artwork has gone from being a piece of art to being a piece of commercialized media. If you don't look at the Goreguts part of the Considered Dead part, this is true traditional art. And this is why I really like the album cover format as a medium for artistic expression, because one, it's paired with music, and of course we all fucking love music. That's why we're here. We're listening to death metal, and we're looking at art that like matches the mood and ambience of the death metal. But what you get with death metal, because it's such an obscure genre, it's not mainstream. You have mainstream death metal like, I don't know, Gojira, or literally the band Death, whom the genre is named after, the namesake band. But none of that's really mainstream. So like the commercial value of death metal is more driven by the artistic integrity, which means you can come up with cool shit and get away with it. And that's really what Dan Seagrave is trying to do. He's trying to come up with something really cool. And we're going to talk about the rule of cool. And that relates to shooting from the hip, like I mentioned earlier. So the rule of cool is if it looks good, it is good. In terms of music, like when you're playing guitar, we call that Slayer rules. Does it sound badass? If it sounds badass, then it is badass. And if it sounds badass, then, fuck yeah, go for it. That's kind of my take on Slayer rules. So Slayer rules, much like shooting from the hip, much like rule of cool, is about the overall effect. The overall effect of the piece. And that kind of overlooks the technicalities underlying it. And the rule of cool is something that I think death metal needs to go back to, because we got a lot of really technical death metal that has become more like engineering than actual architecture. Architecture is like the artistic expression of building something, and engineering is the mathematical process by which you justify the structural integrity of a building. So anything that you design architecturally needs to be under needs to be informed and built under the conceptual framework of an engineer's approval. But it still needs to be architecturally pleasing. It needs to be aesthetically pleasing. And that's what's going on here. We're seeing something that's very aesthetically pleasing for the most part. It's got Rule of Cool all over it. Of course, Dan Seagrave oozes, character and style and all that. But there's also some amount of engineering going on. Some of the engineering in this piece isn't actually very good. But you don't notice it because it's Rule of Cool. And so that's the thing I want to point out is that Rule of Cool can override engineering. Now, if you're actually building a literal bridge that people are going to drive over, no, it has to be structurally sound. But we're not talking about engineering in the sense of building a building. We're talking about engineering in terms of perspective. So some of the perspective stuff that Dan Seagrave is doing in this is actually kind of fucked up. And by fucked up, I mean like wrong. So Dan Seagrave, as his career advanced, specifically on records like Gateways to Annihilation, he developed an understanding of perspective, a very sophisticated understanding of perspective that enabled him to warp perspective in a way that was really amazing and totally new and unique in his own sort of style. Now, there's a lot of old school perspective warping tricks like forced perspective and various other things of that nature that come from classical Renaissance painting. And it's really funny, but like basically what Dan Seagrave is doing here falls under the Altier school of thinking. The Italian Renaissance school of art is known as the Altier or Altier, depending on how you pronounce it. And the Altier or Altier was a school that you would go to and apprentice under a master, and then they would teach you basically 3-point perspective. Generally speaking, they would teach you chiaroscuro, which is light and shadow, which was the style that was created by Caravaggio. So it's a very traditional formalized school of art, and it's really funny because like we're all a bunch of death metal scumbags, but like our tradition, even though we're a bunch of like scumbags, is actually from this very high culture sort of point of origin. And I think that that's kind of the interesting thing about death metal is it kind of falls into two categories. You have death metal that's more classically influenced, and that's neoclassical metal. And then you have the more modern death metal, which is kind of like gent, and that's actually a little bit more jazz influenced. And that's kind of like how I see the musical spectrum within death metal itself. It leans to one of the two. And in terms of artwork, it's that same way. So when Dan Seagrave is doing something like this, he's leaning towards a more classical informed style. And then if you were to do, I don't know, if you were to bring up, say, Nothing Face, so just give me a second here. So if you were to look at something like Nothing Face, which I've got right here, this is more towards the abstract side of things where it's breaking a lot of rules. It's not really informed by any traditional style. It's more something kind of just out of someone's consciousness, like an uninformed consciousness. So it's a very raw, visceral expression. Voivod's Nothing Face, very famous Canadian metal band, progressive metal band from like the 80s and 90s. Angel Rat and so many others. I can't remember all of their records. I've done a little bit of listening to their catalog. I got to go back and listen to some more Voivod. But the idea about this is like, this is one aesthetic. It's very flat. It's lending itself to classical elements. There's obviously some shadow work here on the face to give it like a perception of depth, but it's very much graphic. And by graphic, I mean a flat graphic image. It's not really designed to be, it's not really designed to be a traditional piece of art in Renaissance terms, like for example this is got a lot of depth. Another example of something like that would be The Hunter by Mastodon. So there's the conventional cover, and this is a really good example. You have the conventional cover. Now this was actually a wood carving that this guy they commissioned to make, and then they took a photograph of it and then made it into the artwork. But getting away from the photograph and looking at the here we go, the special edition like this. Let me open this in another tab. All right, here we go. This is a flat graphic. Like, it's all flat graphic. Like, there's what appears to be some nymphs of some kind on either side. Again, this is the wood carving. It is a three-dimensional wood carving, but look at the background graphics around it. It's very much a design element. You know, if you look at what's his name? So if you look at Paul Romano, there's a very clear kind of graphic style to this as well. Again, there's shading to present like some sense of like depth, but it's very much a graphic. It's very much a graphic image. Like the Leviathan artwork, all of the stuff that's happening around the whale is very graphic. The whale itself is its own kind of graphic. The horse has depth to it, but there's issues with the horse where like these legs are obviously too short. Like these legs are ridiculously short. Like the horse's neck is longer than its legs. So it's not actually accurate, you know. But that's the thing. This is something that's informed by the guy's consciousness. You're not really supposed to, excuse me, this is informed by the guy's subconsciousness. And that's because he had a dream of fire erupting out of the horse. That's literally the dream Paul Romano had that related to this. So it was something that comes from your subconsciousness. It's not something that's actively self-aware. It's something very like deep, and it's under layers of thinking. And you're not really supposed to point out the flaws in it. It's rule of cool. You're supposed to just see it as an expression, and it's supposed to be very visceral and gripping. And this is probably one of Paul Romano's most visceral and gripping images. There's this horse that's got fire coming out of it. It's not fire in the conventional sense, because fire is like an external thing that eats its way into you because it consumes you and reduces you to ash. But instead, this is fire that's actually erupting from within the horse. And the horse is like screaming, but not in my opinion, this is my interpretation of it. It doesn't look like the horse is actually screaming in pain. It looks like the horse is screaming with life. Like it's this visceral image of life screaming for its own assertion of existence, of its own existence, an affirmation of its vitality. So it's very disturbing to look at, because it's like it's a very intense image. It's a very, very intense image. I don't even know what else to say about it. So this is what I'm saying when you're looking at the realm of the subconscious, is that you do something in this tradition, and it's gonna fudge. It's gonna fudge the rules. So now I'm gonna show you something that's like very traditionally versed. That's even more traditionally versed than what we're looking at with Dan Seagrave. So this is Noah Buchanan, and he was my instructor at College of San Mateo. And we're going to look at some things that are just absolutely brilliant. So this is a cool piece because it kind of messes with you. Actually, these aren't. Okay, so they're different pieces. Each one is. See, here's a better one of it. Okay, so this is the Dreaming Girl piece, and this is using a lot of perspective tricks that are weird. So for starters, the head is the thing that is furthest away in this painting, and yet it's bigger than the feet. That makes no sense if this was true perspective. So he's using forced perspective. So what you do with forced perspective to kind of mess with people and create illusions, and this is still a very traditional Renaissance style, but it's still got a sense of abstraction to it. So this is what I mean by rule of cool, is that you can get really technical with it, but you can break the rules and do cool constructions with it. So like in this example, we have a woman who has a head that's ridiculously out of proportion with the rest of her body. She's laying in a foreshortened position. That's what this is called, foreshortening. For starters, we can't see the woman's actual body because she's draped. And that's like a really clever trick because you can't entirely see the nature of her body. It's implied that, following my mouse, this is her shin, that's her knee. Somewhere over here is her thigh. This is roughly her hip. And then we basically see her breasts. We can't see her shoulders, but they're somewhere down here and somewhere around here behind her breasts. And then here's her arm and her hand, and then this hand. Maybe her hands are in the right perspective. I can't really tell, but I know that the head's wrong. And so the way, and I say wrong, I mean not wrong like bad, but just wrong as in they're not a coherent perspective. There's a difference between something being wrong and something being bad, right? And that's aesthetics. So when I say something's wrong, it's like it's just not in the same perspective. So like this head's much larger, and so what Noah did was he was standing at one perspective in relation to the model who he was using as a reference. He drew her body in a sketch that's an expression sketch. It's a very quick, figure drawing sketch that's done to just capture the expression of the body and of the movement. And then he laid everything out, and once he knew how he was going to lay things out, he then decided to come up with some fucking pop-ups. He decided to come up with some ideas to make it more interesting. So he added compositional elements like this book, which obviously has some symbolic meaning. These flowers have symbolic meaning. And then, of course, she's resting on a pillow, and the dress has its own kind of meaning. And she's very beautiful, obviously. So it's a comment on beauty. And then, he started to mess with the perspective. And what he did was he created the head in one form of perspective that was separate from the body. So what you could do is you could draw an entire picture around the head, and the perspective of the body would be much bigger and it would be a different scale. The body has its own perspective that is separate from the head, and if the head matched the body perspective, the head would be much smaller. Now, why did he do this? Well, as humans, we are coded to look at the head and see it as a focal point. And we're coded to look at that head as a focal point because it's a point of interest. We look at each other's faces when we speak to each other. We look at each other's faces when we're evaluating symmetry of the face to see if we find the other person attractive, to see if they could be a potential mate. There's so much that goes into it innately without us even thinking. It's just inherent in our function as a species. So by making the head a little bit bigger, he's making it hyper real. And that's one of the terms that I'd like to kind of like introduce into this series is hyper real. It's like a Quentin Tarantino film. It's like, it's not surreal where like you're in a dream and you're obviously in a dream. It's hyper real where it's a dream that almost feels real. It's like even more immersive. It like crosses the threshold of the uncanny valley and enters this other realm. And that's related to the suspension of disbelief. We talk about that in literature where you're willing to suspend your disbelief when you watch Harry Potter. There's people flying around on brooms. Obviously that doesn't fucking happen in real life, but here we are, watching a bunch of children flying around on magic brooms trying to catch a little golden ball that's flying through the air, this little golden ping pong golf ball thing. And you're sitting there like actually immersed in it, and you're hoping that Harry actually gets the snitch and that he's actually going to win the game. And it's Quidditch, and we're suddenly immersed in it. And of course, in the game of Quidditch, there's bludgeons, and there's the Seeker, who's what Harry is, and then there's the Quaffle and all these other things. And it's like, of course that's what it is. It's like self-evident that that's what the rules of the game would be. Like, what could the rules of the game Quidditch be besides what they are? But that's exactly the point. The rules of Quidditch could be anything. She could have added additional rules, any other number of twists and turns to the game because she created it. It could have been anything. The reason why we accept what it is she created and presented to us is that it was coherent enough and there's an immersion into it that results from that coherency, that the coherency of the world building and of the game and of all the layers around the Harry Potter world make us buy into it and believe it, even though we're watching somebody fly around on a broom, right? And that's why like Quidditch is kind of ridiculous because there are people who actually try to literally play Quidditch in real life and they run around on like a broomstick and it's like the goofiest thing ever because they're trying desperately to simulate this hyper real fantasy because it was so immersive to them it felt real. That's why people actually like will go out and play Quidditch even though it's totally absurd and just like the most ridiculous and kind of stupid thing to watch people do, running around on a broomstick. The whole point is that in Harry Potter, you're not on the ground, you're flying. But because people can't do that, but they're still so committed to that suspension of disbelief, they will actually go through the process of running around with a broomstick between their legs, holding it with one hand while they're trying to catch the ball over here. It's crazy shit like that. And that's what I like about it, is that there's this willingness on the audience's part to buy into something that they know isn't real, but they still want to buy into it because it's just so beautiful. And that's shooting from the hip, that's suspension of disbelief, that's rule of cool, that's Slayer rules. It's that melting of the dream and reality because this head is in perspective, this body is in perspective, but they're two separate perspectives. And when you meld them together, you get something that's like in between reality and illusion. And that's the dream. And this is still traditional Renaissance style because you have to learn to draw each thing in perfect perspective. And then you can break the rules and blend them together. In music, we talk about this with jazz when we go from the major scale to the minor scale because you have to create a 2-5-1 in the minor scale. And in order to create that, you generally default to the harmonic minor or more commonly the melodic minor version. And obviously, there's going to be some arguments between the natural major and a melodic or harmonic minor because the natural major is the natural major scale and harmonic minor has a sharp 7th and melodic minor has a sharp 6th and 7th. But you need those extra accidentals in the minor scale to create a dominant chord in the 5th position relative to the minor root. And so you break the rules of the major diatonic scale to create this minor tonality, but that's the beauty of jazz. It comes from breaking the rules. You have to study the formulas and the rules and construct them in that fashion before you can start being abstract and breaking them. And the more you study the rules and gain that traditional knowledge and experience, the better you'll be later on when you break the rules because you have that robust skill set and you can produce highly traditional technical drawings, highly traditional technical performances in terms of music or in terms of art because you have that traditional background. And then when you blend the traditional with the abstract, that's when you're creating this dream world that creates the illusion, but it's greater than the illusion. It's the dream that exists above the illusion because you know when you're deceiving yourself to an illusion. That's called disillusionment, kailasa, to be in a state of disillusionment. But when you've blended them together and you achieve something greater, then that is the dream. It's this elevated state of consciousness and it's beyond reality and it's dealing with the spiritual bodies that exist beyond this life. It's the divine. And that's where that abstraction comes from. So, that's where all of this goes back to Dan Seagrave. because this is a very traditional drawing, and this is very early Dan Seagrave, and this is Dan Seagrave learning to do technical drawings and then trying to begin to introduce abstraction. And he's doing somewhat of a good job and somewhat of a bad job. He's breaking the rules, and some of the rules he's breaking really well, and some of them he's breaking poorly. So we're now going to look at how that all works. So with the first layer, this is just a very rough outline. This outline is me drawing with my stylus, wherever the hell I put it, right here. So this is me taking my pen stylus and just drawing across my tablet. I'm not using any rulers, I'm just visually looking at it. So this is like the most simplified, just like looking at it perspective. As we get deeper into the analysis, I will actually bust out the ruler and show you where the measurements become incongruent. Now, here's the thing. On a cursory glance, most of this checks out, which means that he has achieved a technical level of competence that passes the eye test. The eye test is, if you glance at it, does anything immediately pop out wrong to you? If the answer is yes, then you probably need to go back and work more on your perspective. If the answer is no, nothing immediately pops out at me, then what that's telling me is that you've got enough technical skill to convince me that you know how to draw something that actually is fairly representative. Now, I've got a trained eye, relatively speaking. I'm still improving and working. You know, I had the honor of studying with Noah Buchanan, the guy who did those dreamscape paintings. But I'm still always improving, and I want to get better and honor the tradition that Noah introduced me to. I feel very fortunate to have worked with him. He teaches, by the way, at the College of San Mateo and at UC Santa Cruz. And he does art galleries all the time in New York and even in Scotland and, you know, all over the world. So he's a brilliant dude. And you should look up Noah Buchanan on Instagram or wherever you can. Let me see him right now. What's his page? Yeah, it's just Noah.Buchanan. You should totally look this guy up. He's a great human being. Okay. So Noah introduced me to that cursory glance thing, like you skim it, like you're skimming a sheet of notes and you're looking for the most pertinent details that you know are going to be on the test. So from a skimming perspective, most of this checks out. I'd say that this doorway is a little bit weird and feels kind of in a forced perspective, but for the most part, this checks out. And here's how we're going to explain that. So we have basically the frontmost point, which exists over here, right above this little gargoyle guy. I'm going to kind of zoom in right over this kind of gargoyle's head. This line and this line intersect right where this green dot is that I drew. And again, this isn't going to line up perfectly. You can see that my yellow line doesn't perfectly line up with the corner of the casket. But again, this was a quick drawing, so it's not supposed to be perfect. And if I can very quickly draw an outline over it and it looks relatively okay, then, you know, that makes sense to me. So some things that are going on here, the casket lines up pretty well. This is the frontmost point, which is the A point that's lined up with this green dot. We have B and C representing the back line of the 3-point perspective. This is the triangle that's representing the plane. So we have these 2 points in the background going to here. The vanishing point is actually here, and it's opening up outwards. So because it's opening up outwards, we actually call this like a perspective point. If it was inverted, where it was a funnel that was narrowing down, then it would be a true vanishing point, and the vanishing point would be off in the distance. So in this case, it's actually up here, this front focal point. Now, technically speaking, there is a vanishing point here where this line of the casket and this line of the casket intersect here, and this is the edge. This edge right here is basically another vanishing point. So we've got like a focal point here and a vanishing point here. And so what that creates is this diagonal line, which is the blue line, which is the surface area, the widest portion of surface area on the piece. And going right through the middle of that is the skeleton, which is why we're looking at the skeleton right away, because it's not only in the center of the piece, but it's in the focal point plane, and it's in the center of the focal point plane. And on top of that, the skeleton is yellow, which is a contrasting color to purple. So it's actually pretty well thought out in terms of some basic geometry and basic color theory. This is actually a pretty well thought out piece. So let's look at the next thing. I mentioned that the doorway over here is kind of fucking weird, kind of wonky. So this line right here kind of shows where this doorway is actually in a line with the casket, which is just kind of a weird thought. How this edge right here lines up with this edge. And I get why he did that, but I probably would have lined this up with something else. I probably would have created a vanishing point where from this corner it lines up to here, and then this would line up with something else. And the reason why it's weird is that it makes this feel like it's higher up than this. And once you realize that this stairwell, gateway, whatever you want to call it, feels like it's physically higher up than this, even though it's further back, that kind of like throws the fucking perspective into a weird position. Because what it's saying is that like you're at a slant. Like this corner here is higher than this one. And that's weird. That's really like a weird fucking perspective thing to look at, because it creates like a weird fisheye. So this is where it starts to fall apart, because this thing itself in its own isolated perspective works, but the second he adds these other elements in the background, it gets fucking weird. So we said there were three compositional elements. There's the ghost creature, there's this doorway thing, and then there's this center thing, and then there's a 3/4 framing device, which is the archway going across. This archway. That is the framing device. It frames 3/4. This bottom quarter here is not framed by it, but that's okay because this framing device covers the vast majority of the painting, and so it gives us a relatively clear idea of the framing and the scale of the piece. So that works as a compositional element. But let's talk about some compositional elements that don't work. So for starters, the placement on this is weird and it's kind of fucking with me when I look at it. I probably would have put this into perspective with something down here and would have made a line going down along this bottom edge and made this parallel to this and just shifted it off to the side and maybe a little bit. I mean, it probably does need to be a little bit upward, but having this edge line up with this is too far upward. It feels, what he's doing is he's using forced perspective, where because this is higher than this, he's pretending that this space is really big. But the problem is it doesn't look very big, and that's because we have an arch piece going off at the top, which is this framing device, which actually creates a sense of claustrophobia. This is a small tomb. This is a small mausoleum. And yet, this piece here feels like it's supposed to be further back than what the physical construction of the room would contain. This should be like way fucking smaller if he wants it to be this way. But it's not in perspective, and it's in a weird position, and it's in a comparative position to this centerpiece that's causing tension. Another thing that doesn't really work compositionally, these three pillars here are fucking obnoxious, and we're going to talk about why they are obnoxious. These three pillars here intersect with this corner, and when I turn this line on, you got to remember that this is a corner and this is a corner. This is a diagonal, and this is the most important perspective in the entire piece. Is this diagonal running through here The diagonal runs from the top of this gargoyle all the way into this black abyss over here. And to have these three poles intersecting that diagonal is very visually obnoxious. It interrupts the path of the eye, and I think it distracts from the geometry and destabilizes the picture, which is unfortunate. I think that it's an issue that's a technical issue that can only be resolved by the process of reduction, which is less is more. It's better to have fewer visual elements in a picture and have them more technically rendered and more accurately rendered than to be juggling more pieces than what it is you can handle, because then you're going to drop the ball at one point. And so these pillars are an example of a dropped ball hitting the floor, and that's no good. So in my opinion, this is kind of fucked up, and this whole thing over here is kind of fucked up. That doesn't mean that the piece is bad. What it means is we're looking at Dan Seagrave's developmental process as an artist, and we're seeing the internal workings of his mind and how it is he's thinking his way through these problems. Because he wants to create a sense of four corners, right? We got this corner here, we got one corner here, there's this one right here, and then this is technically an implied corner. And so there's this feeling that there's basically something like 8 chambers. There's one here, there's one right here that we're technically standing in front of. Then there's one in this corner. There's going to be one over here on the other side of this wall. There's the one over here that this ghost creature's coming out of. This one here, and then this is the gateway, which again feels weird because it feels like this should be divided into eighths, but there's this weird element here which feels like a ninth element, so it's not symmetrically divided, which is also another reason why it feels fucking weird. And what I would have done to draw this is I would have done a top-down octagon on a piece of paper, and I would have drawn out where I want all of my elements to lay, like in an architectural top-down map, and then I would have tried converting that into a three-point perspective, and I would have tried to rationalize my three-point perspective based off of a top-down floor plan. Because if you're actually trying to draw something that is architectural, you have to understand that the architectural process is a top-down perspective. So if you are trying to draw something architectural that is very, very, very heavily engineered, like, for example, a mausoleum, which is what this is, it has very complex archways, it has symmetry, the geometry is very concrete. Another example are the vaulted ceilings of chapels. If you're going to draw something like that, you should look at the deconstructed rendering of the engineer's blueprint, because that's going to actually help you understand the relativity of these objects. Dan didn't do that. He's shooting from the hip. He's going for rule of cool. So he didn't do his technical homework. This piece in the center is technically sound, and arguably the archway is technically sound, but all this stuff in this back area is kind of fucked up and weird. And what we're seeing is him grow as an artist. So while I'm saying that this stuff back here is kind of fucked up and weird, I'm not saying that as a criticism. I'm saying that as an analysis. And what's going on is we're seeing him grow. And that's more than what most artists can say. Most artists wouldn't have the guts to, throw themselves at the wall and say, I'm going to make a painting, I'm going to put it on an album cover, and I'm going to fucking get it into production, and then I'm going to do the next painting, and the next one, and the next album cover. And that's why we have Dan Seagrave, because this guy has been doing this shit for 20 fucking years, and he never quit, and he kept working at the process. So again, none of this is a criticism, it's just an analysis. So when I say something's fucked up, that doesn't mean that it's bad, it just means it's wrong. Something wrong isn't necessarily bad. You did it the wrong way. Try again and you'll get it right. If I say that's bad, then that's like, no, you fucked up. And that's different. And the only thing that's bad is basically quitting. And that's the thing. Dan kept at it. And you'll see in other pieces, you'll see that the ideas that he's establishing here become way more concrete elsewhere. So let's go into some of the more technical shit. Okay, so here I actually have the lines using the ruler tool, and these are very carefully outlined. So we've got two sets of lines, and we're going to kind of go through them. So we have the blue set of lines, which are analyzing the two sets of diagonals. And then we have the red set of lines, which are outlining the general square. So I'm going to go ahead and turn off the blue lines. That's a blue one. Okay, so all the blue lines are off, and I got the one yellow line. I'm going to turn that off for now. Okay, so this is the actual surface area of the sarcophagus. He cut off the corners to make it look like eighths, and that's again another reason why I think the geometry of this tomb is to be designed in eighths, because there's four sides to the sarcophagus, and then if you want to basically geometrically subdivide 8, you could, or subdivide 4, it subdivides into 8. And so that's why I think there should be 8 chambers, but this, again, this doorway represents a ninth element, which just feels fucking weird and out of place. This would feel better. I think it would feel better if the composition was different. If this wasn't here and instead this pillar was here, I think this composition would be better. Like, this doesn't need to be here. It's an unnecessary element. And if these columns were over here, the overall composition would be simpler because you'd be combining these two elements into one element. You'd be juggling less. You'd be able to better position the two. Because if you actually put this in perspective, which should be somewhere around where these pillars are, the issue is then you're kind of making this area very claustrophobic. So you need this negative space to actually give these elements breathing room, but this negative space isn't actually proportionate to what everything else is in. And so I don't think this is actually right. And again, this is an example where less is more. But let's look at these vanishing points for a second. So we've got our 3-point perspective where we've got a vanishing point here, a vanishing point here, and it's forming this 3-point perspective this way. We've got a vanishing point coming out to here, and we've got a baseline going across. And so again, this is why I'm telling you that it feels like the viewer is standing right here underneath the CO next to the D. Like you're standing right in this area, which is basically the midline, and then over a little bit. It's like right about here of the picture, which means like where you're standing here, there'd be a chamber over here and another chamber over here, and that would be the 8 normal chambers if this stupid fucking doorway wasn't here. And that's, again, this is the viewpoint of the person looking at things, but the issue is that if we go back in, it looks like things are kind of curved, like they're kind of fish-eyeing out. And that's the thing, like this top perspective is not in alignment with the bottom one, which is a warping, and that's fine, except it's kind of odd. So let's turn this guy on. So this yellow line is the intersection of these two red lines, which represents where the corner is. And as I said earlier, these 3 pillars are intersecting this, and that's bad because it's basically distracting from where this corner of the sarcophagus would be, because this is intersecting it. So if you have a point, if you have an intersection point on a visual focal element, this is a visual element that is a focal point, and this is the corner of that focal point, you should not have something intersecting it. That's just a basic rule of composition. You should not have something intersecting one of your focal points. This is a focal point, and this is a focal point. Let's go back to the earlier drawing. See that purple or that light blue line? So here's the green dot that I just kind of sketched in by guessing, and here's actually the yellow line, and it's not too far off from where the green dot was where I eyeballed it. So that green dot should really be here. I'm going to just kind of move it there. That green dot is the visual focal point. You should not have something intersecting it, and yet that's what's going on, and it looks like shit because of that. So this is a mess, and it should not be here. If he wanted to keep this element, he should have moved it to the side in this negative space. This negative space should have been bigger. This one should have been the pillars, and then this should have been something else. Like another ghost. Maybe he does another ghost over here or something. But this thing shouldn't have been here. Okay, let's go on to the next set. Okay, so let's zoom out to here. This intersection between these two visual guides actually is so big it goes off the artboard. I have to make the artboard bigger to actually show the true intersection of these corners, because this piece goes all the way out to here and then creates this baseline. So this is where those two visual arcs intersect, and halfway in between there is the midpoint. Now the main thing that matters is that there's this baseline that's shared between the red series and the blue series. Here's the red one, and then here's the blue one. You see them overlapping. So it's a common field of vision. And that's why I think like it's somewhere between this red series here and this blue series here where the visual centerpiece is. And I think it's like somewhere around here, maybe around here, where you as a viewer are standing, and that is your perspective outwards onto this piece. And that's kind of where I get that idea, because there's these intersecting planes. So the red lines, again, demonstrate the overall rectangle, but then these blue ones are indicative of the corners. And they're basically there to just add more authentic detail. So let's turn this off and go look at the next layer. So this is the perspective of the doorway, which I said was kind of fucked up. So over here is a vanishing point, and this shit's kind of fucked up, the perspective. This represents the back line of the inner doorway, and this line right here actually runs parallel to the inner line that represents the corner here. So this is the corner, and right here at this point where my mouse is at is where this intersects the bottom floor and the back wall, and this perspective here, this inner wall to this left side, is not in our view from the perspective. So this is the intersecting point of the perspective, and if you extrapolate the line outwards, this is essentially where the two lines have a visual focal point, which means that this is essentially where the wall would end. When realistically, if this was to be in perspective, this line here, and I'm going to turn on my direct selection tool, if I can actually get the fucking thing to work, should disappear something like this. And then it would have to open up into the back and actually give you a sense of opening backwards. But instead, it actually seems as if the wall ends here. So instead of it actually being a chamber, it's an eyelet. So like if this was an eyelet, you'd have a statue here and then a wall behind it, and that would be an eyelet. But that's obviously not the implication of this piece. The implication of this piece is that it's a chamber out of the fucking mausoleum. But to get to this chamber, you have to get past the ghost. At least that's the idea that I get from it. That you're in this underground haunted chamber, and this is maybe the way out, or maybe a way deeper underground, and there's demonic ghost creatures that would rip you to pieces living in here, and then there's of course this undead guy who's kind of like rising out of his casket. I don't know. Anyway, this whole thing is fucked up and makes no sense. That's all I'm going to say about that. Let's look at this point of perspective. This is the one that I showed you in the very beginning, and this is one of the more visually intense perspectives. We have a baseline point from here to here, and what I'm going to do is bring this guy down to there, and I'm going to go show guides. Come on, give me a guide. Unlock guides. Why are you not giving me a guide? There we go. Okay. So as you can see, this guide right here does not actually intersect this. So again, right here, this focal point doesn't actually meet this baseline, which means that these two points are slightly off. And you'll see that like this top one lines up, but these bottom ones don't. These ones don't. And this one kind of does, but it's off of midline. This purple line right here is the midline. So these two should intersect on this purple line, but unfortunately they don't. And in fact, these two, when they intersect, are way over here. This one would intersect like so. This one would intersect like so. That's a fuck up. Let me make sure I get that perfectly correct. I'm going to be super nitpicky. Okay. So what's happening is this is the true corner here. This point here. This right here is a baseline. And so you can draw a plumb line from here at a 90-degree intersection point that is perpendicular to this baseline. But instead of getting all of these three other points in alignment with this, they're all off of alignment. And you got to remember, this is a top of a step that's on the outside. This is a baseline. This is the most bottom part. This is the most inside of the step. This is what you would be stubbing your toes against if you were standing on this. This is the part that your heel would be falling off of. And then this is, again, the part you'd be stubbing your toe against, except this is the floor, and that's the first step. And this is the top step. So none of these steps are in perspective with this top piece. And remember, we said the most important piece is the top of the sarcophagus. Everything else down here is to emphasize the importance of this. And the more geometrically synchronized these areas are down here with this, the more cohesive the overall piece is, and the more your eye is drawn into this section because of the geometric intensity. But the problem is we see that it's skewed. And as it goes down, the skew is different. This skew point is actually a little bit further out than this one. And then this one's further out than the top one. So none of these are, at least, they're not even skewed in the same position. They're all slightly skewed off. These two are pretty much in the same position, but this one's significantly off down here, which means that this whole bottom sarcophagus, all of these planes down here are totally fucked up and out of perspective and make no sense. And that's the issue, is that like there's a lot of problems with the perspective. Now, let's go ahead and turn off some of these pairings. So this purple line, I can draw a connection point to, give me a second, from here to shift there, like so. Then I go in, zoom in, go plus to there, go to there, direct selection tool, delete that, zoom back out. I'm going to just kind of, there it is, that's the spare point. I'm going to delete that point. And join those. Okay. So this is the front focal point, and now I'm going to make these guys yellow-ish. That's a plane. Now that plane represents this top step right here. So like this whole top step. Now if I go from here to about here, that's going to intersect like so. Shit. So you can see this right here is not running in alignment with this. And if I go from corner to corner, right like that, and then it intersects there. This triangular plane in the front represents this corner here meeting this corner here, meeting this corner here, which represents the three of them. And then based off of these 2 points here, I should be able to roughly estimate that these are somewhere around here. The problem is the perspective of these corner pieces is kind of off as well. And when you start breaking it down, the geometry very quickly dissolves. And the issue with that is nothing is really in clear perspective, and it's all kind of fucked up and wonky because nothing is coherent to a central baseline. There should be one central baseline that everything has a coherence to, which would be this top plane. But because nothing is really coherent to it, there's some issues. And the clearest example of that is this is a diagonal and it's not intersecting this corner here, which is one of the visual focal points. It's actually the closest visual focal point, and then this being the second visual focal point. This right here should basically run parallel to this to give you a sense of accurate perspective, because these two things are so close to this top plane, there shouldn't be any discrepancy in the perspective. And the fact that two objects that are so close to each other have a discrepancy that's relatively large as this gap here, because of that, and I'll see if I can maybe more carefully illustrate it. I'm going to go to here. So that shaded area, that's the discrepancy, and it's kind of fucked up. That's why it's doing that. I had a spare thing there. So this shaded area is really fucked up, and that's the discrepancy between this top piece and this plane down here. These two planes are off from each other when they should be congruent to each other. The closer elements are to each other, the more congruent they should be. The further away they are from each other, the more rounded and warped they are, because the Earth is literally round. The problem is these objects are so close to each other, it should be nearly imperceivable to the human eye that there's a warping. The only way you can really perceive the curvature of the Earth is to be really fucking high up in a mountain or in a plane looking down at the Earth. And I've been skydiving, and when I went skydiving, we were jumping over a body of water. And I kid you not, I could see the spherical nature of the Earth, and it was a round body of water. Now, when you think about water, water is self-leveling. It wants to conform to the surface of the Earth. So when you're far enough up in the air, you can see that it's conforming in a sphere. But the thing is, when you're looking at it from ground level, it looks flat, right? And that's the thing that's trippy about it, is that it's a sphere, but we think it's flat, but it's not flat. You have to get a sense of perspective to actually recognize that the Earth is not flat, it's round. But you have to be far away to see that perspective. Up close, you can't tell. And so the issue is this should appear flat, but it's round, which is wrong. Even though the Earth actually is round and everything is technically round, it's such a minute amount of roundness that we shouldn't be able to visually perceive it. And yet there's this huge margin of error. That's a huge margin of error. And that's, again, this is not a bad piece of art. There's a mistake, it's wrong, but it's not bad. It's just wrong. But just because something's wrong does not mean it's bad. And just because there's a lot of mistakes in this doesn't mean that Dan Seagrave is a bad artist. It just means that this is a piece that's from early on in his career. He's learning to work with perspective. We've obviously seen him as an artist grow and become an icon of the industry. So we know that he gets better and grows past this. So thank you for joining me on this adventure. We examined a lot of things that were really fucking weird with this piece. It's a very interesting piece. It's a deep cut. It's an old one. I want to do a shout out again to Rahul Kumar for being a fan and liking my videos and showing interest. And thanks for recommending this video. I can do more Dan Seagrave stuff if that's what you guys want. Post a comment on the video, like the video if it was good. If you appreciated the commentary I gave. I know I did a lot of introduction stuff in the beginning, but that's because I was trying to explain, perspective. again, this is something from a traditional sense of perspective. This is the traditional school of perspective, so it's meant to be very militaristic. When Dan gets further on in his career, he gets more abstract, which is kind of like where his art moves into the realm of jazz, where there's this militaristic background that's being warped, and that's where the improvisational elements and the real creativity of his art comes in. And that's not to say that jazz is maybe superior to classical. Classical has its own ways of being creative, but classical is a lot more rigid than I'd say jazz is in its composition. But that's also one of the benefits of classical. The the bombastic nature of classical and the grandiose swelling of classical really lends itself to being militaristic like that. You know, you can't really do big jazz band ensembles, they're just too noisy. You know, there's a reason why the apex of classical music is the symphony, which is just this massive orchestra of people working together. And there's a reason why in jazz, the apex of the genre is basically the 3 4 piece combo. You know, they have large jazz band ensembles, but they're really not very good. I'd say like a jazz band that's actually really good is a small, tight cast, you know, 5 people at most, where you only have, you know, some key players like the drummer, the pianist, the bassist, maybe a trumpet player or a saxophone player, and really just keep a limited cast. That's really like the nature of jazz, because there's so much conversationally happening. The more players you have, the more pieces you're juggling, the more noisy and dissident it becomes. Whereas contrasting jazz, classical music, the symphony is having one giant conversation, and everyone is lending their voice to having one very coherent conversation, and it's not an argument. It's a unison. Whereas jazz tends to be an argument, the sides kind of arguing with each other, battling it out with each other. So anyway, that's it. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time. I'm Keenan Fry, and this is the Acid Drip.
Hey, visit theaciddrip.com for more content.